On December 25, 1776, George Washington stood on the freezing, wind-battered banks of the Delaware River, watching the very last exhausted remnants of his crumbling American army prepare for what seemed to any rational military observer like an absolute suicide mission. The wind was howling with a violent, piercing intensity, driving a sharp, stinging mixture of freezing rain, sleet, and horizontally blowing snow directly into the faces of men who were still wearing their rotting summer clothes, in the absolute dead of a brutal North American winter. The vast majority of these suffering soldiers did not even have proper leather shoes remaining to protect their feet from the ice. They had been forced by sheer poverty to wrap their raw, bleeding, frostbitten feet in dirty, torn rags, literally leaving a highly visible trail of crimson footprints on the stark white snow of the riverbank as they marched. Across the black, churning, violently moving water lay the firmly occupied territory of the most powerful, well-funded empire on the face of the earth, heavily guarded by a disciplined garrison of professional, elite killers who had spent the last 6 agonizing months successfully hunting these exact same Americans across 2 different states. Washington was about to aggressively order 2,400 starving, freezing, thoroughly exhausted, and demoralized men to climb into heavy, cumbersome wooden cargo boats, navigate a fast-moving river, choked with massive blocks of jagged ice in the middle of a screaming nor'easter, and march 9 treacherous, slippery miles through pitch darkness to attack a superior, well-rested enemy force in their sleep. It was a tactical order that violently violated every single established rule and principle of 18th century European military doctrine. It was an order that the aristocratic, highly educated generals of London and Paris would have laughed at as the desperate, pathetic flailing of a doomed amateur commander. It was an order that George Washington never, under any normal circumstances, should have given. And yet, as the brutal reality of history would soon prove, it was the only conceivable order that could possibly save the fragile, dying infant United States of America from being permanently and ruthlessly strangled in its crib. Imagine for a moment that you are a commanding general in this exact nightmarish situation. You have been handed total operational command of an inexperienced volunteer army that has just suffered one of the absolute worst, most humiliating, and tactically disastrous strings of consecutive defeats in the entire history of your young nation. You proudly started the summer military campaign with a relatively robust, optimistic force of roughly 24,000 confident men eager to fight for independence. Now, in the bitter, unforgiving, freezing twilight of late December, you look at your muster rolls and realize you have fewer than 6,500 men remaining who are actually physically fit for duty. The rest are dead, dying of disease, languishing in horrific enemy prison ships, or have simply deserted the cause. Even worse, the formal legal enlistment contracts for the vast majority of your remaining loyal soldiers expire in exactly 6 days. When the clock strikes midnight on December 31st, your army will legally cease to exist, as the men are completely within their contractual rights to simply drop their weapons, walk away, and go home to their starving families. The wealthy civilian politicians of the Continental Congress, who originally appointed you and enthusiastically sent you out to fight this massive, impossible war, have already fled the capital city of Philadelphia in absolute blind terror, hastily packing their critical documents into wooden wagons and running for the hills of Baltimore to avoid being hanged for treason. Your own men are deserting by the hundreds every single week, losing whatever small faith they had left in the revolution and in your personal military leadership. The massive, heavily armed enemy forces are comfortably and securely camped just a few miles away across the river, simply waiting in warm houses for the winter temperatures to drop just a few more degrees so the Delaware River will freeze entirely solid. Once the ice is thick enough to support the weight of their artillery and cavalry, they plan to march their heavy infantry directly across the frozen river, easily capture the defenseless capital, completely crush whatever pathetic resistance you can muster, and hang you publicly for high treason against the British Crown. This was the absolute nightmare reality that General George Washington faced in the terrible, desperate winter of 1776. The highly professional British military machine, commanded by General William Howe, had completely and utterly humiliated Washington throughout the entire agonizing duration of the New York campaign. The British had brilliantly outflanked his static defenses at the Battle of Long Island, aggressively chased his panicked forces entirely out of Manhattan Island, forced him to humiliatingly abandon his heavily fortified positions at Fort Washington and Fort Lee across the Hudson River, and relentlessly pursued his breaking, starving army all the way down through the entire length of the state of New Jersey. The Continental Army had been severely beaten on the battlefield, brilliantly outmaneuvered strategically, starved logistically, and broken both physically and psychologically. They were the ultimate, desperate underdogs, a ragtag, undisciplined collection of simple farmers, urban mechanics, and local militia trying to fight a global, industrialized superpower that possessed infinite financial and military resources. Washington himself was not universally respected as a tactical genius at this low point in the Revolutionary War. In fact, many of his own highest-ranking subordinate officers and political peers were openly, actively questioning his military competence and whispering about replacing him with a more successful general. He was known primarily in military circles as a man who was very good at executing a desperate retreat to temporarily save his army from total annihilation. But retreating would no longer work to save the country. The Delaware River was the final, critical natural barrier between the advancing British Army and the vulnerable heart of the American independence movement. If the British forces successfully crossed it, the revolution was effectively and permanently over. Washington knew deeply and painfully that sitting still in his miserable winter camp meant slow, inevitable, and dishonorable death for his army and his nation. He needed an absolute miracle. He needed a military victory so incredibly shocking, so completely impossible in its sheer audacity, that it would instantly electrify the dying, freezing heart of the revolution, secure desperately needed European funding, and convince his freezing men to stay and fight past the new year. To fully and accurately understand why this specific battle plan was so incredibly desperate and dangerous, you have to clearly understand the exact nature of the lethal enemy waiting on the other side of the frozen river. The small, strategically located town of Trenton, New Jersey, was currently occupied by a heavily armed force of about 1,200 to 1,400 Hessian mercenaries under the strict, uncompromising command of Colonel Johann Rall. The Hessians were not just regular, average rank-and-file infantry soldiers. They were highly disciplined, fiercely trained, exceptionally well-equipped German professionals whose ruling princes back in Europe had literally rented them out for massive sums of money to the British Crown, specifically to violently crush the colonial rebellion. On the bloody battlefields of Europe, they were deeply respected and intensely feared for their discipline under fire. In the colonial settlements of North America, they were treated like a literal waking nightmare. They fought with a brutal, almost mechanical military efficiency, utilizing strict, unyielding discipline, relentless synchronized volley fire, and terrifying bayonet charges. At the disastrous Battle of Fort Washington just a few short weeks prior to this freezing winter night, these exact same Hessian troops had ruthlessly slaughtered American defenders in brutal close-quarters combat and confidently taken thousands of colonial prisoners, clearly demonstrating a level of professional ruthlessness that deeply terrified the amateur American ranks. Colonel Johann Rall was a battle-hardened, highly experienced, fiercely proud military veteran who had absolutely zero respect for the American rebels he was tasked with destroying. He openly and loudly called the American soldiers country clowns, considering them a pathetic, undisciplined mob completely beneath his professional military dignity. He was so incredibly confident in his absolute military superiority and so dismissive of American capabilities that he blatantly ignored the repeated, urgent advice of his own subordinate officers and flatly refused to order his men to build any defensive earthworks, artillery redoubts, or wooden fortifications around the exposed perimeter of Trenton. He strongly and arrogantly believed that any American attack, should the rebels ever be foolish or drunk enough to try such a thing, could be easily and instantly crushed with a simple, highly disciplined Hessian bayonet charge in the wide-open streets of the town. Rall was incredibly comfortable in his winter quarters, well fed with stolen local provisions, drinking heavily by warm fires, and simply waiting out the harsh winter storms in the warm, dry, requisitioned houses of Trenton. He fully expected General Washington and his miserable, starving army to simply freeze to death in their tents or disband entirely on the Pennsylvania side of the river, solving the entire British colonial problem without the Hessians ever having to fire another single shot. Washington's highly complex operational plan to completely destroy Rall and his veteran garrison was incredibly ambitious and required a level of precise tactical coordination that his amateur, struggling, disease-ridden army had never once successfully achieved in the field before. He intended to aggressively launch a massive, highly risky three-pronged amphibious assault across the treacherous ice-filled Delaware River entirely under the cover of total darkness. 3 separate, heavily armed columns of American troops were strictly ordered to cross the freezing water at 3 different ferry points, miles apart along the river, march silently through the freezing night, aggressively converge on the town of Trenton from 3 different converging roads, and launch a simultaneous, overwhelming dawn attack to trap the Hessians. The main striking force, commanded directly by George Washington himself, would cross the river at a remote, difficult location known as McConkey's Ferry, situated about 9 miles north of the Hessian positions in Trenton. This specific, critical attacking force consisted of 2,400 of his best remaining infantrymen and absolutely crucially to the entire battle plan, 18 pieces of heavy field artillery commanded by a brilliant, self-taught former bookseller named Henry Knox. The physical and logistical reality of executing this plan was absolutely staggering. Getting 2,400 terrified, freezing men across a violently moving winter river is hard enough for any modern military organization. Getting 18 heavy bronze and iron cannons, along with all their terrified, kicking draft horses, incredibly heavy wooden ammunition carriages, and specialized artillery equipment, across a freezing river in the exact middle of a blinding winter night, is an absolute logistical nightmare that borders on the impossible. To even attempt to accomplish this seemingly impossible task, the Americans had spent weeks quietly and aggressively gathering a large hidden fleet of specific local vessels called Durham boats. These were not small, easily maneuverable wooden rowboats. They were large, black, incredibly heavy cargo vessels, normally used by merchants to transport massive tons of heavy iron ore and pig iron down the shallow river from local industrial forges. They ranged from 40 to 60 feet long and were wide and sturdy enough that they could safely carry dozens of standing armed men or an entire heavy artillery piece securely strapped to the wooden deck. But because of their massive size and weight, they were incredibly difficult and cumbersome to maneuver in the water, heavily relying on men using long wooden poles to physically push against the rocky river bottom. A brutal task that was exponentially harder in deep, fast-moving water and terrible weather. And the weather on that specific night was about to violently become the Americans' most dangerous and immediate enemy. If you are deeply fascinated by the incredible, high-stakes strategic gambles and the harsh, brutal realities of historical warfare that actually shaped the modern world, taking a quick moment to subscribe to the channel ensures you never miss these highly detailed deep dives into the tactical moments that completely changed history. Your continued support is what allows us to keep breaking down these forgotten military masterclasses week after week. Now let us step back onto the freezing, wind-whipped, bloody banks of the Delaware River. The official military password for the entire dangerous operation was carefully and deliberately chosen by General Washington himself. It was not a random, meaningless code word or a simple tactical phrase meant just to identify friendly troops in the dark. It was a dark, incredibly blunt, terrifying statement of absolute finality that perfectly reflected the grim reality of their desperate situation. The password passed quietly among the shivering, starving men was victory or death. There was absolutely no secondary tactical plan for an organized retreat. There were simply not enough Durham boats available to quickly extract the American army if things went terribly wrong on the New Jersey side of the river. If they failed to aggressively take the town of Trenton and secure the bridges, they would be hopelessly trapped against the freezing river, surrounded by thousands of angry, heavily armed Hessians and entirely annihilated as a fighting force. As the sun finally set on Christmas Day, casting a grey, miserable, freezing gloom over the entire river valley, the American troops began to move quietly and slowly toward the designated muddy crossing point at McConkey's Ferry. Almost immediately, absolutely everything began to go disastrously wrong. A massive, incredibly powerful winter storm, a classic, fierce Atlantic nor'easter, slammed violently into the river valley, bringing a punishing, blinding mixture of freezing rain, sharp sleet, and horizontally driving snow. The ambient temperature plummeted rapidly well below freezing, turning the mud into solid, treacherous ice. The Delaware River, already a fast and dangerous body of water, quickly became a lethal, unpredictable, chaotic obstacle course. Huge, thick, heavy chunks of ice, some the size of small houses or large military wagons, came tearing rapidly down the fast current, violently and repeatedly smashing into the thick wooden sides of the heavy Durham boats. The specific men tasked with the impossible job of manning the boats, a tough, highly experienced regiment of seasoned ocean sailors and commercial fishermen from Marblehead, Massachusetts, commanded by Colonel John Glover, had to use absolutely all of their physical strength and maritime skill just to keep the clumsy cargo vessels from being entirely crushed or violently capsized by the relentless heavy ice floes. The delicate, highly dangerous process of loading the heavy bronze artillery pieces onto the unsteady boats in the pitch-black night, with terrified draft horses panicking, kicking, and screaming in the freezing rain, was agonizingly and painfully slow. The entire military operation fell dangerously and heavily behind the strict, precise schedule Washington had designed. Washington had originally planned to have all his men and all his cannons completely across the river by midnight at the latest, so they could quickly organize their columns and march the 9 miles down to Trenton entirely in the dark, ensuring they would attack hours before the sun came up. But midnight slowly came and went, and the Americans were still desperately fighting the ice, the freezing water, and the blinding storm. The wind was so incredibly loud that military orders had to be screamed at the absolute top of the officers' lungs just to be heard a few feet away. The enormous physical exertion required to move the heavy cannons through the freezing, slippery mud on the riverbanks drained the men of whatever small amount of physical energy they had left from their meager, pathetic rations. It was not until an agonizing 3 o'clock in the morning that the very last heavy bronze cannon was finally dragged violently up the slippery, freezing mud of the New Jersey bank. And it was 4 o'clock in the morning before the totally exhausted, freezing, soaking, wet American army was finally fully formed up into marching columns on the road. The absolute critical, foundational element of a completely dark surprise night attack was now entirely and permanently lost. They would undoubtedly be marching into the combat zone in the broad daylight, completely exposed to enemy pickets if the storm happened to break and reveal their position. The grueling 9-mile march south down the river road to the town of Trenton was arguably much worse and far more lethal than the brutal river crossing itself. The winter storm unexpectedly and violently intensified, the freezing wind blowing fiercely and directly into the faces of the exhausted, starving American soldiers as they moved slowly south. The country roads were a treacherous, deeply rutted, miserable mix of freezing mud, solid, slick ice, and rapidly accumulating snow. Exhausted men were constantly slipping and falling down, accidentally breaking the wooden stocks of their muskets, and completely losing their flimsy, makeshift footwear in the freezing, bloody slush of the road. We know as a highly verified, documented historical fact that 2 American soldiers actually froze to death right on the side of the road during this brutal 9-mile march. They simply sat down in the snow, entirely overcome by the severe cold and profound, absolute physical exhaustion, and they simply never woke up. The commanding officers rode desperately up and down the long, shivering, miserable lines of men, begging, physically threatening, and urgently urging the soldiers to keep moving their legs just to generate enough body heat to survive. George Washington was a constant, highly visible presence at the absolute front of the column, his heavy riding cloak completely covered in white snow, continually urging his suffering men forward toward the crucial objective. But there was another critical, potentially fatal tactical problem rapidly developing during the terrible march. The driving, relentless freezing rain was completely soaking the men's paper ammunition cartridges and the exposed firing mechanisms of their firelocks. In the military technology of the 18th century, a standard infantry flintlock musket strictly relies on a piece of sharp flint, striking a steel frizzen to create a spark, which then ignites highly sensitive, dry gunpowder exposed in an open metal pan. If that exposed powder becomes even slightly wet from rain, sleet, or snow, the gun simply will not fire, instantly becoming nothing more than a 9-pound wooden club. As the horrifying, demoralizing word passed quietly down the marching column that the vast majority of the men's muskets were now completely useless due to the weather, panic threatened to severely set in among the already terrified ranks. When the dire, critical message finally reached General Washington that their primary infantry weapons were completely disabled by the terrible weather, his response was immediate, intensely aggressive, and utterly ruthless. He explicitly and loudly ordered his commanders to tell the men to rely entirely on the steel bayonet. He fiercely declared to his officers that the town must be taken regardless of the weapons they had available to them. Absolutely nothing, not the weather, not the ice, and not broken weapons, was going to stop this attack from proceeding, because of the severe, unpredictable weather delays and the massive, impassable ice accumulations further down the river. The two other American military columns that were supposed to cross the Delaware south of Trenton and perfectly support Washington's main attack completely and utterly failed in their missions. The treacherous ice and the blinding violent storm were simply too much for them to overcome. Their commanders made the decision to completely abandon the coordinated mission and retreated their forces back to the safety of their winter camps in Pennsylvania. George Washington was now completely and utterly alone in hostile New Jersey territory. He had only his 2,400 tired, freezing men and his 18 cannons marching directly and slowly into a heavily defended town against a massive force of rested, well-equipped, heavily armed professional killers. As the grey, miserable morning finally broke over the landscape, the intense, violent winter storm was incredibly still raging with absolute full force. This terrible weather, which had physically tortured the Americans all night long and killed 2 of their men, now miraculously became their absolute greatest tactical advantage, heavily reducing visibility to near zero and completely masking the loud rumbling sound of the approaching heavy American artillery wheels on the frozen mud. Just outside the northern edge of Trenton, Washington made a critical, aggressive tactical decision and boldly split his attacking force into 2 separate columns. General Nathaniel Greene aggressively took one column down the upper road to violently enter Trenton from the northern side, while General John Sullivan took the lower road to swing wide around and hit the town from the western edge, moving rapidly along the riverbank to permanently cut off any potential Hessian escape route toward the south. At about 8 o'clock in the morning, the American vanguard finally encountered the very first Hessian pickets stationed defensively in the small houses on the extreme outer outskirts of the town. The totally surprised, terrified Hessian pickets hastily fired a few uncoordinated, wild warning shots into the blinding storm and rapidly retreated back into the center of the town. The legendary Battle of Trenton had officially begun. Colonel Johann Rall was deeply asleep in his warm, comfortable headquarters bed when the sudden, distant shooting started. The Hessian garrison had actually been on a high state of military alert for several exhausting days, constantly harassed and annoyed by small, aggressive American rebel raiding parties. And the incredibly terrible, violent weather that morning had completely convinced the arrogant Rall that no major, organized, large-scale attack by the main American army was physically possible. When he was finally frantically awakened by his officers and quickly emerged into the freezing, chaotic rain, desperately trying to verbally form his confused, sleepy regiments in the narrow streets, it was already far too late. The Americans were not just probing the outer edges of the town. They were rapidly pouring directly into the main streets from 2 different directions simultaneously, moving with a desperate, terrifying speed and a violent ferocity that completely shocked the highly arrogant Hessian professionals. But the absolute, unquestionable deciding factor of this historical battle was not the American infantry charging with bayonets. It was the brilliant, rapid tactical deployment by Henry Knox and his 18 bronze and iron cannons. Moving with incredible speed and desperate energy, Knox expertly positioned his heavy artillery pieces directly at the very top of King Street and Queen Street, the two main parallel dirt avenues running straight through the center of Trenton. From this high, strategically elevated position, the American artillery gunners had a perfectly clear, unobstructed line of sight straight down the narrow, crowded roads filled with confused enemy troops. When the highly disciplined, brave Hessians desperately tried to form their standard, tight, linear formations in the streets to launch a coordinated, massive bayonet counterattack to clear the town, Knox ruthlessly and violently opened fire. The heavy American cannons fired a deadly mixture of solid iron round shot and devastating grape shot, which is essentially a giant, lethal shotgun blast of dozens of smaller iron balls straight down the length of the narrow streets. The physical effect on the densely packed enemy was absolutely devastating. The tight, colorful Hessian formations were immediately and violently shredded by the flying iron. Limbs were violently torn off, men were literally cut in half, and the streets quickly filled with the terrifying sounds of screaming wounded men and panicked horses. Every single time the brave Hessian officers tried to violently regroup their men and charge up the streets to take the American guns, the American artillery relentlessly blasted them apart again with terrifying mechanical efficiency. The severe, blinding winter storm that had mercilessly tortured the marching Americans now worked entirely in their favor during the brutal firefight. The wet, exposed Hessian muskets misfired just as often as the American ones did, completely neutralizing the Hessians' greatest advantage of disciplined volley fire and forcing the battle away from traditional tactics and into brutal, chaotic, desperate close-quarters combat. American infantry actively used the local wooden buildings, fences and alleys for solid cover, aggressively pouring whatever fire they could muster into the confused, densely packed enemy ranks trapped in the open streets. Colonel Rall, quickly realizing his beloved elite men were being pointlessly slaughtered in the streets by heavy artillery they could not possibly reach, aggressively ordered a desperate fighting retreat into a local apple orchard on the eastern edge of the town, hoping to somehow organize his forces, break out into the open countryside, and escape toward the British lines at Princeton. But General George Washington had perfectly anticipated this exact defensive maneuver. He aggressively threw his fresh reserve infantry units rapidly around the eastern flanks, completely and totally encircling the orchard before the Hessians could organize a successful breakout. Rall, bravely but foolishly riding his large horse back and forth to rally his terrified, surrounded men, became a massive, highly visible target for the American marksman. He was struck squarely by two heavy American musket balls and fell violently from his horse, mortally wounded and bleeding heavily into the snow. Seeing their invincible, highly experienced commander fall to the ground, and realizing they were completely surrounded by an enemy they had previously utterly despised and openly mocked, the fearsome, elite Hessian mercenaries finally broke. Their discipline shattered. They threw down their heavy muskets, lowered their proud regimental flags to the bloody snow, and formally surrendered to the freezing, starving, victorious Americans. The entire violent battle inside the town of Trenton lasted for strictly less than a single hour, but the outcome was historically and tactically staggering. The tactical payoff of Washington's seemingly impossible, desperate gamble was an absolute, flawless masterpiece of asymmetrical warfare. The verified historical numbers perfectly tell the true, shocking story of this total destruction. Exactly 22 elite Hessian soldiers lay dead in the snowy streets of Trenton. Another 83 were severely wounded by the relentless artillery and musket fire, and nearly 900 professional German soldiers had been captured alive. Washington had successfully and brilliantly captured roughly 1,000 of the most elite, highly trained troops on the North American continent, along with absolutely all of their valuable weapons, massive stores of gunpowder and ammunition, 6 beautiful brass cannons, and desperately needed winter supplies. And what did this impossible, miraculous military victory actually cost the Continental Army? During the actual violent combat in the streets of Trenton, the Americans suffered exactly 0 men killed in action and only 5 total wounded. One of those severely wounded men was a brave young junior officer named James Monroe, who was shot deeply in the shoulder and nearly bled to death on the freezing street from a severed artery, only to survive the horrible wound and eventually become the 5th President of the United States. If you add the 2 unfortunate men who froze to death on the brutal, torturous march, George Washington had completely annihilated a major, fortified enemy garrison at the unbelievable, miraculous cost of just 7 total casualties. It is a casualty ratio that completely defies military logic, mathematical probability, and rational belief. The wider strategic zoom out from this specific, localized tactical moment reveals a massive, fundamental strategic earthquake that permanently changed the world. Just hours before the Battle of Trenton, the entire American Revolution was effectively completely dead in the water. The Continental Army was rapidly evaporating into the winter. The civilian government was in terrified hiding, and the British commanders were literally preparing the logistical paperwork for a final victory parade. Immediately after the stunning victory at Trenton, the entire geopolitical landscape of the global war drastically and violently shifted. The absolute shock of an amateur, starving colonial militia, utterly crushing elite. Undefeated European mercenaries echoed loudly and powerfully all the way across the ocean to the royal courts of London and Paris. When the expiring enlistment contracts finally came due a few short days later, many of Washington's men, riding high on the unbelievable thrill of this miraculous, impossible victory, willingly chose to re-enlist and stay with the starving army for another brutal year of fighting. The powerful, wealthy French government, which had been secretly watching the colonial conflict to coldly gauge American resolve, clearly saw that these Americans were indeed capable of bold, incredibly decisive military action against the best troops in the world. This specific, impossible victory laid the crucial, necessary diplomatic groundwork for the eventual formal military alliance with France that would actually provide the ships and guns to win the Revolutionary War. The Battle of Trenton absolutely did not end the war on that freezing day, but it absolutely, unquestionably ensured that the war would continue to be fought. If we look deeply through the long, bloody annals of military history, we can clearly see the striking, powerful echoes of this specific kind of strategic audacity. When the legendary Carthaginian commander Hannibal Barca decided to march his massive army, complete with heavy African war elephants and tens of thousands of infantry, over the frozen, incredibly treacherous, deadly peaks of the Alps to strike deep into the unprotected heart of the Roman Republic, he was employing the exact same tactical logic. You intentionally and aggressively embrace an environment so incredibly hostile, and you execute a plan so physically punishing to your own troops that the enemy commanders cannot possibly conceive of you ever executing it. The extreme deadly terrain and the violent weather effectively become a brilliant tactical cloak that perfectly hides your true strategic intentions. Both Hannibal in antiquity and George Washington in the 18th century deeply understood that sometimes the absolute greatest, most effective weapon a desperate underdog has at their disposal is the pure, irrational willingness to endure a level of intense physical suffering that a comfortable, superior enemy considers totally impossible. Today, the exact historical crossing point on the Delaware River is an incredibly quiet, beautiful, heavily forested historical park. The dark, cold river flows calmly past the muddy banks, completely hiding the extreme violence, the deep fear, and the absolute, paralyzing desperation of that freezing, stormy Christmas night in 1776. It stands today as a silent, powerful, enduring witness to the exact historical moment a truly desperate general willingly threw away the traditional military rulebook, completely ignored the impossible mathematical odds stacked against him, and aggressively ordered his suffering men directly into the lethal ice. It is a stark, lasting reminder that human history is almost never shaped by perfect, flawless plans executed in perfect, comfortable conditions. It is heavily shaped by sheer, unyielding, irrational willpower in the face of absolute impending disaster. If you want to see more detailed, highly accurate tactical breakdowns of exactly how impossible military odds were violently overcome by strategic brilliance and sheer human endurance, hit that subscribe button right now and let me know down in the comments section below which unbelievable historical gamble or forgotten military campaign we should deeply analyze next.